Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Will Your Recovery SLA Become a Broken Promise? I'm Kevin Collins from Unitrends, and I'm here with Joe Noonan, Vice President of Product Marketing and Product Management. He'll be taking us through the presentation. Don't forget, one lucky attendee will be walking away with a $100 Amazon gift card. We'll contact the winner via email after the webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. The session will be recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version. I would also encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can do so by typing them into the Q&A box in the bottom right of the player. We'll answer your questions at the end of the session. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joe. Enjoy the presentation, and Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for joining us, everyone. Hopefully, I will be as brief as I can, and you'll get out of here having hopefully learned a few interesting things, or at least discovered a few tools you can look at for your situation. I really like the topic for today. We're not talking about ransomware or anything like that, but when you look at what just, again, another global attack yesterday, I think Petya or some flavor of that name was the primary culprit this time. Ransomware in general is helping people, I think, realize, wow, I need to be pretty proactive these days around gaining confidence and keeping my environment, my applications and my business services up and running. And this idea of an SLA, and we'll talk about some basic stuff, and I apologize if some of the stuff is pretty basic, but then we'll get into some really cool detailed things as well. And I'll talk about some specific ways Unitrends can help, all within the idea of how you can start being more proactive. Right? A service level agreement around recovery is 100% a proactive type of thing. And this, what we're going to talk about today is how to make that an effective endeavor for your organization, because there are some pitfalls, and we'll talk through those and how to solve them. So some of that basic stuff, and again, apologies if some of this is a little too basic for some of you, but we have a lot of folks that join our audience that are learning some of this stuff for the first time. And by the way, I've actually had conversations with even analysts that have actually used some of the aspects of an SLA and recovery time, recovery point objectives, and all those types of things a little bit incorrectly. So just want to make sure folks understand some of the nuances. So the first thing, when we talk about a service level agreement around recovery, obviously it's an agreement. Sometimes it's contractual, and you're really focusing on what downtime and data loss will have, what kind of impact that'll have from an event that'll create those. Ransomware is obviously one example. An outage from, basically fire, flood, all that kind of stuff, full disasters, or even just minor outages. All these things have an aspect of what this recovery SLA would entail, and you have to think about all those things. And the contractual piece is something we'll get into when we talk about cloud providers and things like that, for sure. Potentially, if you're providing services yourself, obviously putting contracts in around recovery SLAs can happen there as well if you're taking over some of the infrastructure, managing it, or providing some level of service that has to do with keeping applications available. So what goes into it? And I'll go through each one of these in detail in a little bit. It's a little bit mundane for some folks, but again, I mentioned there are nuances and relationships around these that I think are important. So you have your RPOs, and we'll talk about the details and what that is. Your RTOs, and of course your recourse, right? What happens if the SLA isn't met? So let's get into those very quickly. Now, from an RPO, recovery point objective, this is really saying, this is kind of putting an agreement in place around how much data you're willing to lose. What can we accept as data loss in this sense? And how you measure it is actually pretty simple. Now, a lot of people will often think that if I have a backup product or I have a replication product, if I just set a schedule and within that schedule I protect things at a certain frequency, that's my RPO. The reality is an RPO at the business level has to do, again, if you think about it at the business level, how much data loss you'll actually be able to accept, how much data loss will happen. It's really the measurement of the time difference between working recovery points. Right, I can set a backup schedule or replication schedule to happen every minute, but if I have issues with 5 or 6 of those that happen as a part of the process, they aren't working recovery points. I'm losing data. Because so the schedule doesn't dictate what your actual RPO is. It dictates what your RPO can be, right? And then the idea here is really understanding and making sure that these recovery points are successful and working. And that's the proactive aspect of where we're going with this conversation, is making sure that you have more confidence and understanding that these things are working, and that you have an understanding and an assessment of what that real measurement truly is. So those are some of the nuances that when I have conversations with customers, with partners, and even analysts, they often don't always understand that. My slides are moving slow here. So RTO, recovery time objective. This one's a little bit easier. Fewer nuances, but still some nuances. How much downtime will I accept? But the interesting part is, what counts as downtime in these types of objectives? It's going to depend on your situation. So sometimes you'll look at an RTO and you'll say, well, it's the amount of time for a system to be available. Because there's certain aspects of things that you can't control in your organization once the systems are available. Others might look at it, and if you look at it from the business perspective, it really in a lot of cases is, how long am I down for my entire application? How long am I down for my users to actually be productive again? So if you think about an RTO with the respect of how a business runs, the infrastructure will likely have 5, 6, 7, 100 machines, sometimes depending on the situation and the application, that work together in order for end users to be productive. When those things aren't all up and running in the right order and working together, the users feel like you're down. Now, the infrastructure side, you may feel like these things are up and running because maybe they all did boot. But if they're not functioning and the dependencies aren't working together, then really, honestly, you're still down at that point. So how much downtime are you willing to accept? And when you measure that, again, it will vary depending on your situation and what you can control and how you want to set up your SLA. But I always like the idea of at least making sure you understand the concept that downtime is considered downtime if your users are not functioning and productive with the infrastructure, from the infrastructure. And I think that's one of those nice little nuances there to keep in mind. Now, recourse, what happens if my SLA is not met? All right, this is the last part of it. Sometimes maybe you get money back. That's always a nice thing. Other times there could be credit. So if you're using a service, for instance, a lot of disaster recovery providers will give you credit towards the service itself. So if they miss the SLA, they don't necessarily say, here's money back, but here's a form of financial recourse in terms of a credit to your service and things like that. Now, forget about, disaster recovery as a service and cloud providers and all that kind of stuff. What if it's, an agreement that you're making within, your organization? Maybe you're a service firm that's offering IT services to another company, not cloud related, just, managing the infrastructure and the applications, or you're just working for your organization as a part of the IT group. Having an SLA and not meeting it, that can sometimes result in job loss, right? That's sometimes the penalty that you have to pay in those scenarios when it's not necessarily a service-related or service-related setup between you and the organization that you're providing. And then in a lot of cases, and honestly, this is there all the time, all over the place in the cloud world. We're going to talk about disaster recovery as a service later, and you would be shocked to know that there often is just no recourse in a lot of cases when an SLA isn't met. And that's a big part of the problem here, is that there's more awareness being generated with ransomware and things like that. There's more proactive thought to these topics, and we're seeing a lot of progress, but there are still a lot of areas where you just don't have these in place, and there's just no recourse. So, do you have documented recovery SLAs? Are they defined and documented? And, we use a little Family Feud quote here. Survey says, and this is because Unitrends has done many surveys and talked to many customers around this, not likely. If you are one of the folks that really truly has this documented, defined, and has it as an SLA either with your organization, with your customer, whatever that might be, that is awesome. But most of the data that we see shows that most people don't. And that's obviously another part of the issue here. And when you wonder why, when I talk with folks, I ask that question all the time. And a lot of times it's lack of accountability. And that, by the way, this isn't meant to be a negative towards anyone that doesn't have these defined or documented. In no way am I saying, well, people just don't feel that accountability. That's not what I'm saying. What I just mean is they may not have a structure in the organization or with their customer to where there's really an understanding of who can truly deliver that SLA, therefore there isn't an SLA. Other times it has to do with confidence, right? If understanding and benchmarking what can actually be done and knowing what can actually be done and what the impact of an outage would be is actually very, very difficult and new in terms of solutions that are out there. You have, hundreds of backup vendors, hundreds of disaster recovery vendors, lots of providers doing disaster recovery as a service. And to be honest, in most cases, none of them are going to actually give you much confidence in terms of how much data downtime and data loss you'll take, because they're not telling you. And if you're not being told, or you don't have processes and technology in place to really understand it and feel confident about that, then how much do you really want to go out there and say, here's my documented defined SLA that I really don't have any confidence in? And then the last part is understanding impact. And I kind of touched on this with the confidence part, right? Sometimes folks don't necessarily understand what that impact of an outage will be for them, so they're not really thinking in terms of the business and the recovery SLAs. And that's very common for folks that are wearing many, many hats, and backup and disaster recovery is just one very tiny, tiny hat that they have to wear. They don't want to think very much about it. It's not their forte, and they're trying to basically make sure that applications and infrastructure are just available and running and performing and rolling out for their organization the way that they need to, because there's a new phone system they want to implement, or there's a new tracking system for sales, a new CRM, whatever that might be. There's just lots of things on their plate, and understanding the actual impact of an outage is probably very, very far down in their priority. Again, I think things like ransomware are helping people kind of realize that it needs to be a part of the priority list in that top piece when you do roll out a new application or implement something. All right. So solutions, right? How do we get in and really start, providing ways to have solid recovery SLAs, ones that you can feel confident, have accountability, and have a good understanding of that impact. So we'll start here. I think, assessing and planning is always a big, big part of this. And what's always important, and by the way, most of you probably get this, again, lots of new folks, some people not directly in the space, but prioritization is key and budget's going to be key. I have budget last there, but to be honest, in a lot of ways it's first, because in the end, you would love to just say, hey, listen, I don't want to accept any downtime. I don't want to accept any data loss. Screw that. This stuff's important. I can't take that. And a lot of people feel that way. I know that a lot of your users feel that way for sure. But they all know that, you don't have an infinite budget, and that stuff costs a heck of a lot of money. And it's painful to do sometimes to literally have 100% uptime availability and no data loss. There are impacts to that, especially at the budget side. So most times you have to prioritize. What are your most important applications? What are the dependencies around those applications for how they are recovered? And again, you might have AD, database backends, application servers, web front ends, or some other combination. And all these things need to work together in order for your end users to be productive. So prioritizing your infrastructure and your applications, understanding the process and defining how recovery needs to happen, that's a really important thing to understand up front. And then, of course, putting technology behind it so that, yes, you might have to do some things manually if you can't necessarily afford the technology, but hopefully when you start thinking about total cost of ownership and how much the manual process can take out of your day, that's cost. How much the manual process could be adding risk to your recovery scenarios, that's big cost if an outage occurs. So if you're thinking about all those things from a TCO perspective, you won't have too much of a hard time saying, okay, technology is really important to invest in. I need to automate. I need to make sure that I have good replication. I have local protection. I have off-site protection. All the technologies are in place to make sure that I can recover very quickly. And these days, obviously, there are a lot of cool recovery technologies, especially in virtual environments, but also for physical environments, that will get you up and running pretty quickly. But technology is not the only part of it, right? They're again, the prioritization and the process. Spinning something up very quickly is really cool, but not necessarily doing the full job when it comes to people actually being productive, right? You need to have known good backups, known good replication and recovery points, and obviously good workflows and processes that allow for the dependencies to be taken care of so that everything is available for your end users. So how can we help a little bit with some free tools? So there is a website called drbenchmark.org. Slightly outdated, there are some updates being made to it, but this website is pretty cool in the sense that you can go and take this free survey. It takes about 10 minutes or so, and it'll come back and grade your disaster recovery preparedness and your current strategy and planning in comparison to others that have taken the test, as well as to some other benchmarks. So really cool stuff there that if you're brand new to this and you are one of those folks that have a million hats and this is just one of the ones that you're adding to your repertoire, really cool thing to go and visit and kind of see where you are and where you stand and learn a little bit about the types of things you should be thinking about when it comes to a disaster recovery plan. And I talk about disaster recovery here in the sense of SLAs because we talked about before, if you don't have that assessment, that plan in place, the prioritization, the right technologies, all the way through to meeting that with your budget, you're ultimately, SLAs, it's about having a strategy, right? It's not just something you throw on a piece of paper and hope that it's going to work. Going back to the title of all this, right? Will your SLA be a broken promise? That's how a lot of people do it. They'll say, well, I think, this one I can only take an hour of downtime. This particular application, I can only take 4 hours of downtime. I can only lose, 30 minutes of data. Do you know if that's what you're achieving? That visibility is a big deal. And then another free tool, so Disaster Recovery Planner. This actually will develop a free disaster recovery plan for you, and you can access it. It's online, it's available. So if you actually do run into a disaster, this can actually house your plan. And the plan goes beyond just infrastructure and technology. It's process, it's people, all that stuff. So really, really cool tool. This can be accessed right from the Unitrends website. Again, completely free, not a trial, nothing like that. Just one of those additional things we provide to help people start thinking about these things in advance. So where recovery happens. So we talked before about having to plan for different scenarios, right? Your SLA is something that you kind of put in place at the application level. Maybe it's at the site level. I recommend application level because that's what helps you really understand how to meet budget. One application is typically not equal to another in terms of its importance, but it can be in your environment. So application level is good, but where is recovery going to occur has a big impact in terms of the technology you choose to meet your SLAs. So local, obviously, files get deleted. Lots of human error can occur in this case, or you could just have hardware failures and things like that, but not major outages. But obviously recovering at the local site is pretty critical, having good technology, which is typically going to be in your backup provider handling that. Second site. So you can choose to manage your own secondary site because you're going to need something in the form, if a true disaster happens, right? A power outage, something major that takes down lots of systems at once and you need to fail over to another site, you can actually run and manage your own secondary site. So it'll be important to have good replication technologies, technologies that are bandwidth efficient, replication going to secondary sites. Obviously, people don't have unlimited bandwidth. If you can afford lots of bandwidth, that's great. You can typically do really well on the RPO side because you can pump data over that very, very quickly and frequently, and that allows you to lose less data, which is great. But not everybody necessarily has great bandwidth. It could be where you live. It could be just your financial situation with your company. Heck, I have better bandwidth at home sometimes than we do in certain offices. It kind of depends. So having something that can efficiently transfer data to a secondary site is certainly, one of the most important aspects of this, because if you don't get the data over there, recovery can't happen. Hyperscale clouds, and I'll expand this next one, purpose-built clouds. Just quick definitions, right? Hyperscale clouds, we're talking about the Amazons, the Googles, the Azures of the world. That's what we refer to as the hyperscale cloud. Purpose-built cloud is when you start looking at vendors or managed service providers that have built cloud services specifically to handle this use case, right? And they'll manage this. And so the purpose-built cloud, you're actually just paying somebody else to take this on for you, right? They'll handle the DR part. They may even handle the on-premise backup part, on-premises backup part. Hyperscale clouds, it's often still on you. You still have to do all the planning. You still have to purchase solutions that will handle the replication and spin up within hyperscale clouds. You're just leveraging AWS, or Azure on the back end. So it prevents you from having to spend on all that infrastructure. Now, those last two pieces I'm going to dig into a little bit. So purpose-built clouds and hyperscale clouds. This isn't a pitch. It's not meant to be a pitch. Unitrends, when we talk about Unitrends a little bit later, we support hyperscale and purpose-built. So we're fine either way. But they're not equal, right? There's a reason that when you look at super cheap cloud storage in AWS or Azure, and you automatically think, wow, that's obviously way better for offsite protection, right? It's so much cheaper. It's a cent per gig per month. That's awesome. The reality is there are some drawbacks to that and hidden costs and just in general some important aspects around continuity that don't get solved in those cloud scenarios. They can still solve for a lot of situations, so they're still very viable, still very useful, especially for helping you from disaster and all sorts of recovery scenarios. But when we think about SLAs, that's actually kind of the biggest issue with them. You will not actually be able to get a specific recovery SLA from a hyperscale cloud provider. You can use a really cool product, and that product can, if you have basically warm standbys sitting out there in the cloud, you're just spinning them up. It's the time it takes to boot. You can do some testing and get reporting out of that to feel confident about what those SLAs would normally be in that scenario. That's really cool. By the way, that is expensive as heck. You're going to spend tons of money on that cloud infrastructure for every one of those machines that are sitting there up and running 24/7, having data replicated to them. Typically, that becomes a very cost-prohibitive scenario. Not in every case, but typically. Purpose-built clouds are designed to give you a recovery SLA. There's other ways to do the hyperscale clouds more cheaply, where basically you'll replicate data into the cheaper cloud storage, that super cheap cloud storage that everybody loves to say, wow, this is so inexpensive. You can replicate data into that and then use an import process to automate recovery from the object storage into the compute platform. That is a great methodology of using hyperscale clouds. It's very cost effective, but the problem is now the recovery SLA, that hyperscale cloud provider, that's an import process of data and can be a lot of data from one set of storage into the compute platform. It can take a while. It might take 30 minutes to an hour, but it could be several hours depending on how big the machine is. And what's interesting is, and we've benchmarked this, you can run your tests 4 times throughout the day and you will get pretty different answers. And it's because it's a big shared infrastructure and you don't know what else is going on in there. They won't give you an SLA around recovery. You just can't get it. And that's where purpose-built clouds are designed in some cases to give you that. Now, a lot of purpose-built clouds won't do it either. So this is something you always want to check with those providers. If you go with a Unitrends or a Data or a Barracuda or a Quorum or whoever's out there in this space that has its own purpose-built cloud, check for SLAs. You'll actually find that a lot of them don't do it. And that's an issue too, but they at least can provide it because they can control the infrastructure. Scalability, OS compatibility. So your on-premise environment probably can have some older operating systems, and the cloud providers don't always support some of the older ones, so you want to check and make sure that that's available in the hyperscale clouds. Usually the purpose-built clouds will leverage environments that are pretty compatible with most on-premise environments, and they scale better in a lot of cases. So if I have a VM that has a virtual disk greater than 1 terabyte, I can't even spin that up in Azure, and if I'm using the cost-effective way of spinning things up in AWS, I can't there either. So there are some scalability limits in hyperscale clouds that the purpose-built vendors will solve for. Holistic support. So having a vendor support the entire cloud, the solution, the on-premise piece, all that, one throat to choke, one call for everything, one back to pack. All those are good things around leveraging a purpose-built vendor. and TCO and cost predictability. So when we think about cloud storage being really cheap, as you store more data out there, it becomes pretty darn expensive because you're paying for everything that gets stored. You're also paying hidden fees for what gets taken out from a recovery perspective. And sometimes even, for instance, Azure, their cheap storage, which is really aggressively priced, has a write cost, W-R-I-T-E. So every bit of data you write out there, you're also paying for, and you're also paying for it to land on the storage. So you just got to pay attention. There's a lot of unpredictable costs around that model, where purpose-built vendors will typically price things in a more predictable, cost-effective way when you think about that full DR solution. All right, so I'm going to plow through these pretty quickly, because when we start to think about technology, process, there are just certainly a lot of newer advancements that are being brought to market, not from a lot of vendors. You know, Unitrends is pretty unique in some of these, but there are others out there, so do your homework. But look for something that's ultimately helping you understand what is the impact of an outage going to be. Right? There's a lot of analytics and machine learning and automation that are becoming relevant in backup and disaster recovery products. You know, it's not just about, let me try to make things, you know, let me protect them as fast as possible. You're seeing a lot more intelligence built into them. So look for things that can help you understand the impact of an outage, automate compliance testing and reporting for you. You know, and with ransomware, detect and alert of security threats. That can be a part of the service and a part of the product and the intelligence that's actually available to you. You should be thinking about that with that plaguing us right now. And of course, other aspects and use cases around development and test environments and just making data instantly accessible for those purposes. A little bit different than just your standard SLA, but it can have a play into that SLA piece, because sometimes that can have an impact on your availability of applications. And then, of course, proactively detecting issues within the hardware of your solutions is another form of analytics that's really important. Again, you can't meet SLAs if you're having problems with the hardware that supports your solution, so you can obviously get more intelligence in that area as well. So how does Unitrends help? So lots of stuff that we just talked about there, and I'm going to be pretty quick through the Unitrends piece, and we can do some Q&A and we can get out of here. So on the Unitrends side, we look at driving a lot of simplicity into the equation, especially for folks that have many hats, but also just the approach around simplicity is just important. Even with folks that love spending time in backup and disaster recovery, it makes for a more stable, secure, and more mature solution to basically give you this stack of a solution, right? Servers, storage, a virtualization layer, an operating system, backup software, security, monitoring, analytics. All of that stuff is basically a part of an on-premises solution around backup and disaster recovery. In a lot of cases, if you go with certain software vendors, you're going to have a different product or a different vendor for all those components of the stack. And then when you start adding cloud into the equation, there's more vendors, more components, more products. Unitrends simplifies all of that. We can give you a box. That box is fully integrated and pre-tuned and connects seamlessly into the Unitrends cloud. That's the best value proposition we have there. We do have software that can be integrated into your own environment and your own hardware, and we do have other hyperscale cloud support as well. That's just the best way of us simplifying things for end users. We do have, in the Unitrends cloud itself, this is a purpose-built cloud. We cover physical and virtual environments for full, not only off-site backups, but long-term retention, as well as spin up for disaster recovery, and we do have a 1-hour SLA as a part of that service. And what gets built into that, if we think about the structure of how things work within the Unitrends cloud, it's a tiered structure, right? And the idea is you have pricing and options that will allow entry-level pricing all the way through to something really premium and very cool when you have the budget. So in the Unitrends Forever Cloud, you'll actually buy based on the protected capacity in your environment. So if you have a virtual machine that has 2 terabytes, you buy 2 terabytes. You're not buying some number that ends up getting stored in the cloud that you have no idea how much it's going to be over time. This is how costs get very predictable. It's based on what you have in your environment. And it's in 500 gigabyte chunks. You pick the retention, whether that's 90 days through 7 years, and if you need something beyond 7 years, then heck, we just give you something that's forever. And if you want it less than forever, we'll do that. but we don't have like a million price points on retention. We have about 9. And that allows you to scale your pricing. And then you can start choosing whether or not you want to spin up and fail over into the cloud. When we think about SLAs, recovering just data from your cloud provider, it's going to take longer to bring things back, but that is an important recovery scenario, and that's important to consider for downtime. And having the option to spin up in the cloud as well, if there's a bigger outage or something you can't really fix locally very quickly, that's where the DR as a service comes in. And you can basically we have a SKU that basically says for anything you send up to us, you can spin it up as a part of your DR. Now, there's no SLA with that because we don't know enough about your plan to say that we know how long it's going to take. But it still gives you an option if you don't have a secondary site and it's low cost. So it's important to know. Some applications you may not need the SLA because of your budget. Now, you can also buy per instance. Again, that's another simple way of controlling budget. Again, no SLA. Or you can have premium DR as a service, which now does give you 1-hour SLA. We work with you in understanding your entire DR plan. We automate your runbook for you, and we give you monthly reporting that actually tells you we're exercising this, everything is working, and here's the proof that we're actually meeting your SLA. So nice scalable pricing depending on your situation, depending on your applications. And we have this really cool slide with this GIF. So when you think about the 2016 DR as a service Gartner Magic Quadrant and how that shifted to 2017, what you saw there is that in 2017 we had more vendors, but man, the downward pressure and the left pressure is huge. And what that means is that you're seeing a lot of vendors kind of falter in really innovating ahead of the pack. Unitrends was one of them, basically, that moved very, very far to the right, which shows that the service and the capabilities specifically around our automation and our analytics and the holistic approach of, basically an on-premise appliance and the solution to the cloud has just ultimately delivered great service, and that's what's really helped Unitrends be one of 4 vendors this year that improved in both execution and vision, completeness of vision. We're in the top 4 for the breadth of the solution around completeness and vision. And out of those top 4, love IBM and SunGard, but man, those are really expensive services. So they typically go after enterprises, a lot of mainframe and basically duplicate infrastructure types of scenarios. So they can cover just about anything, but very costly. They typically are not serving the SMB and mid-market space. So Unitrends is one of 2 with Hyperscale really hitting that full gambit of SMB through enterprise. And when you start comparing Unitrends to any other vendor on this quadrant, we're the only one that actually also lives on the backup Magic Quadrant for the same solution. And that's important because this is all going to start with backup. When you think about your SLAs, they're going to start from what are you going to do locally. You have to be protecting. And having the great, strong on-premises capabilities that can extend to an innovative, well-placed VR solution, Unitrends stands out quite a bit. But that was around Unitrends Cloud. If you're looking at AWS and Azure, we can handle migrations, disaster recovery, off-site copies, as well as backing up those cloud virtual machines if you are looking at having infrastructure out there. So the SLAs still need to be in place for where you might be running data and applications in the cloud as well. So important to think through those as well. I don't want to say Unitrends Cloud is the only option. We love AWS and Azure. Lots of great integration there as well. And available later today. Today will be the GA date. Version 10 will build right into the user interface, really cool visibility, analytics, and automation that will actually tell you the impact of an outage. So I can see compliance with my RPOs, my RTOs, whether or not I have systems that are recoverable because they've been automatically tested. All of that is right there visible in one glance in a dashboard with one-click drill in to the details at an application level, showing you what your RPO was and what the actual measured RPO is. For instance, in this one, I don't know if you can see the numbers that well, but I have an RPO of 24 hours and an RTO of an hour. And our analytics and testing are showing that we're meeting both of those. We have 15 hours and 43 minutes on the RPO, and we've measured 3 minutes on the actual RTO for spinning up that application. So you now have visibility into that process and what the impact of an outage would be, how much data you would lose, how much downtime you would take. Huge, huge information in terms of you getting to that point where you can deliver and document an SLA. And then, of course, we're not helping you too much if we don't tell you what's wrong. So as a part of that process, there is automation that will actually go in and test to make sure applications, their dependencies from a database to a website to AD to all aspects of the application, we're actually able to test and validate real recovery for your end users, not just do I have a system up. And that's important too. So wrapping up here, thanks for joining. We have a couple cool ways for you to, get involved with Unitrends. We have trials, cool ransomware detection features built into those trials. We have a free product as well for backup and recovery. Always happy to show you demos and talk to you whenever you need to. So Kevin, I think we're ready for the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Joe. There's still time to ask a question. If you want to do so, just type it into the bottom right-hand side of the player, and we'll get to your questions here as soon as we can. First question is, does the SLA cover ransomware and viral attacks?
So when you say does the SLA, I'll answer this because that could mean different things. So in general, with an SLA around recovery, in that concept, does it cover those attacks? It absolutely needs to. Those attacks are causing downtime. They're forcing people to recover to their backups, which causes data loss. And if you chose to pay the ransom, then you may not lose any data, although obviously during that scenario, data might not be getting updated in those systems, but you're down, right? So there's an impact to every outage that's related to those security threats that's got to be a part of the SLA plan. If you're asking, does Unitrends cover that as a part of the Unitrends cloud and things like that, the answer is yes. Everything I just showed you will ultimately measure and understand our RPO and RTO capabilities for you and your environment and your scenario, and whatever that outage might be, if it's ransomware or other, is included obviously as a part of that. Because really what we're doing is analyzing and making sure that your protection, your backups, your replication, your long-term retention, all of that is being done properly so that you can recover, and we're helping you understand that it is working recovery points. We know when those are. We can test those and tell you that we know that they're working, and we can get you up and running pretty quickly as a result.
Okay, next question. Can we incorporate Unitrends into our existing SAN, or would it be standalone?
So good question. So Unitrends can be deployed as a virtual appliance or as a physical appliance. So the answer is yes. If you're saying, can I use my own storage? Because I saw that you had a box there, and I have lots of storage, and I want to use that. The answer is 100% yes. So we have virtual appliances that can run on VMware, Hyper-V, Citrix Zen Server, and I know you asked about SANs, but we can run in AWS and Azure and protect out there as well. So yes, you can definitely leverage your existing infrastructure for the process as well, and it still connects directly into the cloud, and it still incorporates all the analytics and monitoring and security all within that virtual appliance. So you don't get the benefit of having a pre-integrated, pre-tuned server and storage with your backup software and everything that goes along with what Unitrends is giving you. That's the difference there if you don't go with our appliance. But at the same time, cost is important. If you have lots of extra hardware you want to use, you have a good, HP or Dell agreement or IBM agreement, by all means, go ahead, use those and leverage Unitrends for the software piece.
Okay, next question is, aren't public clouds like AWS and Azure a lot less expensive than using a vendor cloud or MSP?
So it's all vendor clouds and MSPs, they price differently. So there's always that caveat that it depends. The cool thing, so we're going to have an online tool available very soon. I really wish I had it so I could have had the link up here. But talk to someone at Unitrends and we'll be happy to show you, because we have calculators that help people understand this. So when you look at a solution that has any form of retention, because most people need retention for at least a year in a lot of cases for some sort of compliance. With AWS and Azure, let's say you're doing 1 or 2 cents a gig, you're paying that for every bit of data that goes out there. And if you're using the really cheap storage, it's actually tough to be really optimized from a WAN transfer perspective as well as a deduplication perspective. So you tend to use a lot more storage out there as a part of that process versus something that might be more optimized and have deduplication on the back end. So you store, the point of that is you store a lot of data. Then if you think about recoveries, how much is it going to cost when you actually recover into the cloud? That can be very costly as well. So purpose-built clouds, you've got to check their pricing. But if you look at something like Unitrends, we can give you, so a hyperscale cloud is not going to give you an SLA. And if you don't need one for some of your applications or all your applications, you determine, hey, Joe, I listened to your presentation, screw you, I don't need it. But if you don't need it, then you can buy a very simple option from Unitrends that just says for all the data you're replicating into our cloud, you can spin it all up whenever you want. That ends up being a very predictable and greatly more effective from a cost perspective against the AWS and Azure approaches in most cases. So talk to us, because we actually have integration with AWS and Azure to do both, and that's how we've learned some of this stuff over time. It's just about understanding all the little hidden fees that are associated with hyperscale clouds.
Okay, next question is, can you cover multi-platform sources like VMware, Hyper-V, and Physical? And does Unitrends sit on my hardware platforms?
The answer is yes to all of them. So VMware Hyper-V, also Citrix Zen Server for at least off-site retention. Spinning up Citrix Zen Server VMs, you'll have to use agents on those machines, so we can still do that as well. And physical machines we can protect with an agent and put an agent on those machines, do the protection, replicate, and spin up as well for DR as a service. So we cover all those, and we talked before, you can use your own platform and leverage one of our virtual appliances to run in that virtual environment, and that virtual appliance will also be able to deploy agents and protect your outside physical servers as well. Or you can have a recovery series appliance which will ship you the box, and that'll just talk to your virtual environments, or it'll talk to your physical servers to do the protection. So you have both options.
Okay. Next question is, how does Unitrends verify that my backups are working so that I can recover when I actually need to?
So as a part of that process, we're always doing things at the data level, like matching checksums and things like that, to make sure that what we read and what we write is good. But that block level information and that file level information only kind of gets you so far. It doesn't actually say that everything was all good. I could have read data the way that I thought I was supposed to, but VMware could have told me it was a different block and my backup would be bad. So there's a lot of reasons that that's not enough, but that's something we do. But what we do that goes well beyond that is, when I showed the screenshots, we have a job in our product called data copy access. And with that, you basically will set up application dependencies, all the VMs, boot orders, the workflows, all those types of things that are needed to understand if the machines and the applications and everything in them are actually fully recoverable, and recoverable in the sense that they are all up and running and working the way an end user would ultimately need them to be working. That's all automated. So you can set that up and it'll automate that process, and it'll run analytics against it to tell you, here's the RPOs and the actual RTO against that application. And we've actually tested and shown that it's all known good. I'm actually going to go back to one of the slides here that just shows you kind of that process where it will step through, perform instant recovery, spin it up. We're not using any extra storage on your end. It all sits on our box. But it efficiently and effectively, and does not impact production environments whatsoever, allows all the recovery testing to be automated for you. And we have some pretty cool videos that show you how it's done as well on the website.
Okay, last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Is there an option to select the geographic location where data is stored in the cloud?
Yes. So if you're using our integration with hyperscale clouds, that is available to you, as well as with the Unitrends cloud. We have multiple locations depending on where you are, and we can contractually handle data sovereignty for you.
All right. Well, Joe, thanks so much. It was a great presentation. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version within the next day or so. And we'll also announce the $100 gift card winner within that email as well. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to having you on future webinars. Take care, everybody.